On the morning of July 8th, 1972, a passing motorist in rural Allen County, Indiana, came upon a heartbreaking scene. In a ditch along a quiet country road lay the body of a young mother, and beside her was her 3-year-old daughter, extremely frightened but miraculously unharmed. Just hours earlier, 26-year-old Phyllis Baylor had been alive and on a journey. The young mother had set out the previous evening from Indianapolis, driving a borrowed car to visit her parents in Bluffton, about 100 miles away, with her toddler in tow. When she failed to arrive, her worried family reported her missing. Early that next day, police found Phyllis's car abandoned on the shoulder of northbound Interstate 69 in nearby Grant County. The car's hood was propped open as if it had broken down, but Phyllis and her child were nowhere in sight. Approximately an hour later, the dreadful discovery was made. Phyllis's lifeless body and her little girl were spotted in a roadside ditch, miles from the highway. Investigators from the Allen County Sheriff's Department and the Indiana State Police rushed to the scene and launched an investigation. It was immediately clear that Phyllis had met a violent end, which was confirmed with certainty at the autopsy. It was also confirmed that the perpetrator had subjected her to the most disturbing form of assault, leaving behind the biological material that would ultimately crack the case. Her daughter, though physically unharmed, was too young to provide any useful details about what had happened. Detectives were left with a horrifying crime and very few initial clues. Phyllis's purse and belongings had presumably been in the car, but the car was found empty and in working order aside from the raised hood. Authorities could only theorize that Phyllis had experienced car trouble and that someone had taken advantage of her vulnerable situation. The remote location where her body was found suggested the perpetrator had driven her and her daughter off the interstate onto a secluded road to carry out this horrific act. In the summer of 1972, however, there were no surveillance cameras on highways, no cell phones to ping, and DNA analysis was decades away from being a useful tool. Investigators had to rely on old-fashioned police work, combing the area for witnesses and piecing together Phyllis's last known movements. In the immediate aftermath of Phyllis Baylor's slaying, police pursued every lead they could find. They interviewed other motorists who traveled I-69 that night, hoping someone might have seen Phyllis's green vehicle pulled over or noticed a stranger lurking near a distressed driver. They spoke with Phyllis's family and friends to determine if she had any enemies or troubled relationships that could suggest a suspect. Standard procedure in cases like this is to look first at those closest to the victim, a spouse, an ex-partner, or friends, but nothing indicated that someone in Phyllis's circle was responsible. From all accounts, Phyllis was simply a young mother on a routine trip. There was no obvious personal motive, which made the crime even more baffling and terrifying. It appeared to be a random act of violence. Before long, investigators developed at least one potential suspect based on the limited evidence and tips they had. Details about this early suspect were not released to the public, but authorities privately considered him a strong person of interest. Perhaps it was a local man with a history of violence, or a passerby who matched a description from a witness sighting. However, in 1972, they lacked the forensic evidence to make a charge stick, something that would actually turn out to be fortunate given subsequent developments. Despite their efforts, no arrests were made, and the case began to go cold. Families in the area were left to wonder if a predator was still among them, and Phyllis's loved ones were left with agonizing questions. Who attacked her, and why did this horrific monster decide to spare her child? The Phyllis Baylor case gradually became one of Indiana's most stubborn cold cases. For decades, Phyllis's family, and in particular her daughter, received no answers. Periodic news stories recalled the tragic tale of the young mother found in the ditch, but as memories faded and investigators retired, the trail to her perpetrators seemed to all but disappear. Thankfully, it wasn't that police didn't have any evidence. They did recover physical evidence, but the perpetrator's identity remained hidden within it, literally at the molecular level. By the early 1990s, as DNA profiling emerged in forensic science, hope was rekindled. A partial DNA profile was eventually developed from biological material found on Phyllis's clothing, presumably from the assailant. When investigators compared this DNA profile against the man they had long suspected, the results were stunning. The partial profile eliminated their main suspect. It was now 2 decades after the crime, and the authorities were back to square one. Throughout the following decades, the Indiana State Police Cold Case Unit periodically revisited it, especially as DNA technology improved over the years. Each advance in forensic science brought a new opportunity to glean more information from the evidence, but for a long time, the DNA sample was too degraded or incomplete to point clearly to one individual. It yielded no matches in CODIS, the FBI's database of convicted offenders, because the perpetrator might never have had his DNA taken in a criminal case, or he simply wasn't in the system. Meanwhile, as the decades went by, Phyllis's daughter grew into adulthood, believing that the man who committed this evil act was likely walking free. Little did she know she would soon find out that the man responsible for her mother's death had suffered a fate that would have caused a medieval inquisitor to furiously take notes. In 2024, the cold case detectives investigating Phyllis Baylor's slaying decided to leverage the latest cutting-edge technology. The Indiana State Police Laboratory re-examined the genetic material from Phyllis's clothing and managed to develop a much stronger DNA profile of the unknown suspect. This new profile was more complete, and thus far more useful for searching in modern DNA databases. Traditional law enforcement databases still didn't have a direct match, and the DNA profile didn't match with any known convicted offender. So investigators turned to an innovative method that has been solving cold cases around the country in recent years: forensic genetic genealogy. This is a painstaking process, building out family trees from distant cousins and obscure records, but it paid off, big time. By early 2025, the investigators had zeroed in on a name. After 53 years of mystery, the DNA left on Phyllis's clothing finally had a match in the family tree: Fred Allen Lineman. Lineman was a 25-year-old man originally from Anderson, Indiana, roughly 40 miles from Indianapolis, not far from Phyllis's starting point that night. He later lived in Michigan and had accumulated a significant criminal history by his mid-20s. According to police, he had no known connection to Phyllis Baylor. He was neither a family friend nor an acquaintance. This lack of any prior link explains why he was never on investigators' radar. Phyllis almost certainly didn't know him at all, a chilling hallmark of stranger-on-stranger violence. When detectives dug into the perpetrator's background, they uncovered an interesting footnote on his disturbing life. Lineman himself had died violently in the 1980s. In a grim twist of fate, this man who preyed on a stranded young mother later became the prey himself. Investigators learned that Lineman was slain in Detroit in 1985, under absolutely brutal and gruesome circumstances. Now, usually I don't go into too much detail out of respect for the victims of crime, but I'm going to make an exception here. Lineman, who was by then 37 years old, had crossed 2 very bad men. These 2 men spent some time working him over with a baseball bat, threw him in a dumpster, and then, potentially while he was still alive, lit the dumpster up. I naturally have to wonder if he questioned the life he lived and the acts he committed as the flames rose around him. The Indiana State Police announced the solved case publicly in April 2025, finally bringing a sense of resolution to this mystery 50 years in the making. Indiana authorities noted that if Lineman were alive, he would have been charged with Phyllis Baylor's slaying and prosecuted by the Allen County Prosecutor's Office. Some believe that Phyllis may not have been Lineman's first or last victim, and that he may be connected to other crimes. So far, it's unclear if the authorities are investigating this avenue, but given the random nature of his attack on Phyllis, it's strongly speculated that they are. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you appreciate my content. Also remember to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History, for unsolved mysteries and historical content, respectively. On April 18, 1973, a man in rural Anderson County, Kansas, stumbled upon the decomposed remains of a young male about 3 miles southeast of the small town of Garnett. The body was found near a shallow stream, roughly 180 feet off a country road. Investigators noted the victim's attire and personal items in detail. He was very well dressed, wearing a corduroy jacket, a button-up shirt, stylish jeans, a black leather belt, hiking boots, and leather gloves. The young man also wore jewelry: 2 gold rings etched with crosses, another ring engraved with the number 78, and a silver chain with a 2-inch cross pendant. These possessions offered a few clues, but no immediate identity. An autopsy was performed and revealed signs of severe trauma, including a skull fracture, leading the coroner to rule the death a slaying. The medical examiner estimated the victim to be a white male in his late teens to early 20s, with a slender build and medium-length brown wavy hair. It appeared his body had been at the site for only a few weeks. Authorities believed he had likely been slain about 2 to 4 weeks before discovery, given the state of decomposition. Whether the act took place right there in the woods or the body had been dumped afterwards remained uncertain. Early on, investigators theorized the victim might have been a hitchhiker who met a deadly fate while traveling through the area. Despite these efforts and a thorough search of missing persons reports from the region, the young man could not be identified. With no name to call him, authorities referred to the unknown victim as the Garnett John Doe. When no leads emerged, the community gave the unidentified individual a dignified burial in Garnett Cemetery. The story had moved the local community so much they even raised money for a small headstone, a rarity in cases such as this. And keep this in mind, because this isn't just a fact to help restore your faith in humanity. It'll actually end up helping crack the case. The case of the Garnett John Doe turned cold as years passed with no identification. Law enforcement never forgot the nameless teenager, and over time they revisited the case with new techniques as technology advanced. His information was eventually entered into national databases for missing and unidentified persons as those grew in size and scope over the years. Still, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, no match was found for the Garnett John Doe. In 2005, more than 30 years after the slaying, investigators took a significant step. In a testament to the community efforts to give him a proper burial, they exhumed the John Doe's remains to apply emerging DNA technology. Notably, in many of these cases, the body is buried, but due to poor record keeping, the exact location ends up lost. The community-funded headstone solved this issue. Forensic experts carefully recovered the skeletal remains, which had been well preserved in a vinyl body bag inside a wooden coffin. Once again, another testament to the local community. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation attempted to match his DNA to databases, but ultimately nothing came of this, given the technology at the time. This was a major disappointment to investigators, but all hope wasn't lost. Flash forward to the 2020s, and forensic science has been revolutionized by genetic genealogy. The Anderson County Sheriff's Office and the KBI partnered with a private forensic lab, Othram, who I feel at this point need no introduction. The remains of the Garnett John Doe were sent to Othram's laboratory in Texas, where their scientists successfully developed a complete DNA profile despite the age of the evidence. This would ultimately result in this 5-decade-old case being cracked wide open, but first, there's a parallel tale to tell. While the Garnett John Doe case sat unsolved, another mystery lingered 80 miles away in Kansas City, Kansas. And for those who aren't that familiar with Midwestern geography, there's also a Kansas City, Missouri, right across the state border. In the fall of 1972, a 16-year-old boy named Jimmy Dollison disappeared from his Kansas City home and was never heard from again. Jimmy had been living with his family in Kansas City and by all accounts was an ordinary teenager of the early 1970s. Sometime in October or November 1972, he went out and never came back. His worried parents reported him missing to local authorities, and the family desperately searched for answers. Unfortunately, there's not much out there on the investigative efforts undertaken by the authorities at that time. However, knowing the time period, my educated guess is that the police told Jimmy's parents he's likely a runaway and closed his file as soon as possible. Further, at the time, there were few tools to broadcast a missing person's information beyond the immediate area. Decades before the era of online databases and nationwide missing persons alerts, Jimmy's disappearance remained a local case with little publicity. His relatives never knew if he had run away, fallen victim to foul play, or had an accident. He simply vanished, and no trace of the teenager turned up in the weeks and months that followed. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s and beyond, Jimmy's family was left with only painful uncertainty. They had no idea that their boy's remains had actually been found the very next spring and laid to rest under a nameless tombstone in Garnett, under the careful watch of a caring local community. For over 50 years, the fates of Jimmy Dollison and the Garnett John Doe remained unconnected puzzles, two unsolved mysteries running in complete parallel. In early 2025, after months of specialized DNA analysis, the breakthrough finally arrived. Othram's genealogical research had generated leads to specific families that shared significant DNA with the unknown Garnett victim. KBI agents and Anderson County investigators followed the genetic leads to locate surviving family members of the victim. They identified siblings of a missing Kansas City boy, and in February 2025, those siblings were approached by law enforcement. Investigators conducted interviews and collected DNA samples from at least one close relative for direct comparison. The laboratory analysis confirmed what the officers had suspected. The DNA from the exhumed remains matched the family's DNA. The Garnett John Doe was positively identified as Jimmy Allen Dollison, the Kansas City teenager who had vanished in 1972. The identification was officially announced in April 2025, bringing an end to the 52-year-old mystery of the boy's identity. With Jimmy's identity confirmed, the focus of the cold case has shifted from who the victim was to who perpetrated this act against him. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the Anderson County Sheriff's Office have reopened the investigation, now armed with the knowledge of the victim's name and origin. Detectives are piecing together Jimmy's last known movements in the fall of 1972, hoping to determine how he ended up in Garnett and who might have been involved. Some have speculated that he was hitchhiking westward and may have been picked up by a dangerous stranger. Others have questioned whether someone he believed to be his friend may have turned on him. These questions remain unanswered, but identifying him will give investigators the opportunity to investigate all sorts of new leads. While the case is over 50 years old, most of the people who knew him from school will likely still be alive and potentially be able to give information about what he was up to in his final days. One thing that's unclear to me at present, and that I'd like to know, is whether the police file from 1972 for Jimmy Dollison's disappearance has been preserved in any way. If it has, there may be witness statements which can now be followed up on over 50 years later. That said, it's not even clear to me if the authorities investigated Jimmy's disappearance when his parents reported him gone. It may be that there's no file whatsoever, and never was, which would of course significantly hinder any potential complete resolution to this case. This of course seems incredibly odd to me given that he was 16 years old when he went missing, but this seems to have been the general approach to policing at the time. All that said, if they did any investigative work whatsoever, and if it survived, this could be the key to fully solving this case. By combining the evidentiary value of the Garnet John Doe file, the Jimmy Dollison investigative file, and the DNA evidence, perhaps the authorities can finally resolve this mystery fully. Laura O'Malley was just 13 years old when she vanished from her home in Long Beach, New York, in late August 1975. According to contemporary reports, she had run away after significant tensions at home. She left a message saying she wouldn't return as long as her stepfather was living with the family. About a year after she disappeared, Laura's mother and stepfather separated, and her family pleaded publicly for the girl to come home. Unfortunately, those pleas went unanswered, and New York missing persons detectives chased countless leads in the late 1970s. Laura's siblings never gave up either. They spent years circulating her photo around NYC, believing she might have fled to the city and hoping someone had seen her. Despite these efforts, no trace of Laura O'Malley was found. 20 years after Laura's disappearance on March 22, 1995, a shocking discovery was made on the opposite side of the country. Partial skeletal remains of a young female were found in a remote riverbed off Highway 129 near Watsonville in Santa Cruz County, California. Investigators at the scene noted the bones were badly weathered and initially suspected they might not be related to any recent crime at all. In fact, early on it was theorized to be a homestead burial, the remains of someone laid to rest on family land long ago. Because of this assumption that the bones were historic rather than an active case, forensic analysis at the time was limited. However, despite this, authorities did perform a standard DNA test on the remains, which confirmed they belonged to an unidentified female and didn't match any known profile. The initial misclassification as a historical burial meant precious time was lost before realizing a crime might have occurred. It wasn't until 2019, nearly 24 years after the discovery, that the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh look at the case. Investigators sent the remains for advanced forensic testing, including radiocarbon dating. The results were eye-opening. They indicated that the unknown girl was likely born in the mid-1960s and had died sometime between 1977 and 1984. This firmly placed her death in the late 20th century, not a century or more ago, prompting detectives to reclassify the case as an active cold case homicide investigation. The age of the victim at death was estimated to be in her mid-teens, roughly 13 to 17 years old. Over the years, investigators and amateur sleuths tried to connect the Santa Cruz Jane Doe with missing persons reports from the 1970s and 1980s. Was she a runaway from California, a hitchhiker passing through, or perhaps a victim of foul play dumped by the highway? With no identifying documents or personal items recovered, numerous theories surfaced about her identity and how she died. One early theory, after the 2019 testing, was that she could have been a hitchhiker or transient who suffered an accident near the river. However, foul play couldn't be ruled out. Meanwhile, for the O'Malley family back on the other side of the nation, the decades had continued to pass with no answers. Laura's whereabouts and condition remained unknown, and the California investigators had no idea their Jane Doe was a girl who had disappeared from New York. A breakthrough finally came in the 2020s, thanks to emerging forensic genealogy technology. In 2022, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to try to identify the long-lost Jane Doe. Using forensic genetic genealogy, scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the girl's degraded remains. Investigators on the ground followed these leads to locate living family members of the Jane Doe and obtained reference DNA samples from them. Finally, nearly 30 years after the remains were found, and almost 50 years after Laura O'Malley had vanished, the pieces lined up. In March 2025, officials announced that the once mysterious remains had been positively identified as Laura Ann O'Malley. Laura's case is now officially closed as a missing person case, but it has transitioned into a new phase. Police in California admit they still don't know exactly when or how Laura arrived in Santa Cruz County, or how she lost her life there. Those details remain the final mystery. Authorities are continuing to gather information. At present, they're appealing to the public for anyone who might remember encountering a young girl from New York and California in the late 1970s. The hope is that this identification will eventually lead to justice, or at least a fuller story of what happened to Laura. And while this is just speculation on my part, I would hope that the authorities are conducting a full investigation of the stepfather, who may very well still be alive. Edna Schubert, an 88-year-old widow from North Bay Shore, Long Island, was found brutally slain in her home on December 12, 2003. Concerned neighbors had noticed her front door left ajar and a window shattered, prompting them to check on her welfare. The victim was a retired Department of Motor Vehicles employee who had lived alone since her husband's passing years earlier. She had no children of her own, but was a beloved figure on her street, affectionately known as the grandma of the neighborhood for her kindness toward local kids. Simply put, she was the sort of neighbor everyone wanted to have, and that everyone cared about. Or at least that's what one would assume, isn't it? Suffolk County detectives launched an extensive investigation in the aftermath of Schubert's slaying. Crime scene specialists carefully documented the scene and collected every piece of evidence they could find, including latent fingerprints and blood samples left by the intruder. Despite these efforts, no suspect was identified in 2003. Unsurprisingly, Edna Schubert had no known enemies, and there were no obvious suspects. Early forensic tests failed to match the fingerprints or DNA to any known offender in law enforcement databases, leaving investigators without a viable target. As weeks turned into months and then years, the trail grew cold. The case that had once gripped Long Island gradually faded from headlines, but it was never forgotten by the authorities. By the late 2000s, the slaying of Edna Schubert had become one of the region's most notorious unsolved crimes. As the 20th anniversary of the crime approached, the file on Edna Schubert remained dusty and unresolved, much to the dismay of the community and the authorities. However, in 2023, a spark of hope arrived from a detective who refused to let the case die. Retired Suffolk County Police Detective Pat Albergo, one of the original investigators, contacted the department's cold case unit. He urged them to take a fresh look at the evidence using modern forensic technology, which he believed was the key to cracking the case. Albergo's persistence set in motion a long overdue re-examination of the clues preserved since 2003. Detective Brendan O'Hara reopened the investigation and teamed up with retired fingerprint expert Detective Timothy Kelly to pore over the old evidence. They focused on a latent fingerprint that had been lifted from the crime scene years ago, which initially had been deemed too blurred to yield a match. Using advanced high-definition upscaling, the investigators took a new, high-resolution photograph of the old fingerprint and ran it through a state-of-the-art fingerprint database. And yeah, this stuff was basically science fiction 22 years ago when the crime occurred. It was basically something you'd see on an episode of CSI, but now it's reality. This time, the result was very different. The print came back as a match to a man named Raul Ayala, a known criminal, confirming a major breakthrough in the case. The suspect turned out to have been in law enforcement records already. Interestingly, Ayala's fingerprints were on file from a prior arrest, years before Edna's slaying, but the forensic tech just wasn't where it is today. With Raul Ayala now identified as a prime suspect, investigators dug into his background. They discovered that Ayala had actually been Schubert's neighbor back in 2003. He lived roughly 200 yards from her home at the time of the slaying. Not long after the crime, Ayala left New York and eventually settled in the small town of Talmo, Georgia. Detectives now needed enough hard evidence to secure an arrest and conviction, since the fingerprint alone wasn't enough to guarantee conviction. The team turned back to the biological evidence from the scene. The bloodstains on Schubert's clothing had been preserved, and the DNA had been tested before, but that had never led to an identification. Using updated DNA analysis tools, the Suffolk County Crime Lab confirmed those stains contained a mixture of Edna's blood and DNA from an unknown male perpetrator. Armed with this knowledge, police organized a covert plan to verify Ayala's DNA. In August 2024, Suffolk County detectives traveled to Georgia to discreetly obtain a sample of Ayala's DNA for comparison. Investigators finally closed in on him. They kept Ayala under surveillance and collected items he discarded in the trash. These items included lottery scratch-off tickets and plastic bottles used to gather his DNA without tipping him off. Back in New York, forensic analysts found that DNA from a tossed-out Gatorade bottle matched the unidentified male DNA from the 2003 crime scene. This conclusively provided a link between Ayala and Schubert on the day in question. At last, with the forensic evidence firmly in hand, authorities moved to take Raul Ayala into custody. On January 16, 2025, Suffolk County Police detectives, aided by local Georgia deputies, arrested the 51-year-old Ayala at his residence in Talmo, Georgia. The suspect was then transported back to New York to face justice after more than 20 years living freely after the crime. On February 7, 2025, Ayala was formally indicted in a Suffolk County courtroom on a number of counts related to Edna Schubert's slaying. During a packed arraignment proceeding, Ayala pleaded not guilty and was ordered held without bail by the judge, given the severity of the case. If convicted on the charge, Raul Ayala faces a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of now, it's unclear if the prosecution has any idea why they believe Ayala perpetrated this horrific act on a sweet old woman, but I suspect we may find out soon enough. Ayala remains innocent of all charges until he's proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, with a quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also remember to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History, for unsolved mysteries and historical content respectively. On a Sunday morning in December 1982, a real estate agent surveying a tract of land in Loxahatchee, Florida, stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Scattered human remains were found strewn in a wooded area about 140 yards off a remote road. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office responded and determined the victim was a woman who had been shot in the head. The remains were badly decomposed, likely the result of being exposed to the elements and animal activity, with bones found along the gravel roadway and in the brush. Investigators had little to go on besides the skeletal remains and a few personal items left at the scene. A number of pieces of jewelry were recovered with the victim, some of which were highly distinctive. These included a wristwatch, a gold necklace with an anchor pendant and a key pendant, and 2 rings, one in a small silver heart shape, and the other a gold ring set with 4 gemstone pieces. One of the rings was speculated to have been a wedding or engagement ring. These belongings, along with evidence from an autopsy suggesting the woman had given birth a number of times, led detectives to nickname her the Jeweled Mom. Despite the intimate and possibly distinctive nature of the jewelry, no immediate identification could be made. Forensic experts determined the victim was a white female, estimated to be between 25 to 40 years old and around 5 feet tall with brown hair. She had signs of a past back injury and even traces of pink frosted nail polish on her fingernails, suggesting she took care of her appearance. A forensic dentist charted her dental work, which included crowns, fillings, and extractions, and circulated the chart to over 2,000 dentists across Florida in hopes of finding a match. Unfortunately, despite this significant effort, no leads emerged from the dental records or any other of her distinctive features. From the start, it was clear this was a slaying, but the victim's identity and the perpetrator remained a mystery. In 2013, a sample from the woman's femur was submitted for DNA analysis in another attempt to identify her, again without success. All the while, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office kept the case open and in the public eye. The unsolved case in Loxahatchee didn't exist in a vacuum. In May 1982, just months before the Jeweled Mom was found, another set of female remains had been discovered in the same general area. Those remains, later identified as 17-year-old Tina Marie Beebe, were found in a shallow grave not far from a property owned by Christopher Wilder, an infamous serial predator. Wilder, dubbed the Beauty Queen Killer, would go on to abduct and slay at least 8 young women in a cross-country crime spree in 1984. Given the proximity of the 1982 Loxahatchee crime scene to Wilder's land, investigators eventually took notice. They suspected that the unidentified Jeweled Mom might have been an earlier victim of Wilder. Wilder's known victims were generally younger women, teens and 20s, and he died in 1984 during a shootout with police, never confessing to any crimes beyond those known. Nonetheless, the possibility of his involvement in this 1982 case lingered as an unsettling theory, but I'll come back to this shortly. Investigators also kept an open mind that the perpetrator could have been someone else entirely. Given that she wore what appeared to be a wedding ring, detectives also considered any potential spouse as a prime suspect. By the 2020s, forensic science had advanced dramatically, offering new hope for the Loxahatchee Jane Doe. In 2021, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, to finally crack the identity of the Jeweled Mom. Using trace evidence from the remains that had been preserved, Othram scientists were able to extract DNA and build a comprehensive genetic profile. It was then used in genealogical databases to find familial connections. The process generated leads to a particular family, and investigators then conducted some good old-fashioned police work. They interviewed potential family members identified through the DNA matches and obtained a reference DNA sample from one relative. Eventually, by comparing that relative's DNA to the unknown victim's profile, they achieved a conclusive match. In late 2022, After 39 years of anonymity, the sheriff's office received the news it had been chasing. The jeweled mom Jane Doe's identity was confirmed. She was Leona Jean Keller, born on December 13th, 1945, and 37 years old at the time she was slain. Originally from Pennsylvania, Leona had married and lived in South Florida in the 1970s. She was a married mother of 4, whose family members had reported her missing long ago. However, for reasons that aren't yet fully understood, the missing persons report and the Jane Doe case were never connected at the time. Yet the identification, while a milestone, is only one chapter of the story. The biggest question remains unanswered. Who was responsible for her death and why? Leona's remains were discovered close to property Christopher Wilder owned. His violent methodology, often involving remote disposal sites close to where Keller's remains were found, very closely matched this crime. Combined with the circumstantial evidence about Wilder, this strongly suggests that this isn't a situation where the spouse or a close personal associate was involved. That said, there is one thing that makes me believe that it could have potentially been someone other than Wilder. Leona was 39, and the vast majority of Wilder's victims fell in the late teens to early 20s range, with only one confirmed victim in her early 30s. On a quiet morning in September 2018, a telephone technician working behind a vacant house on Detroit's east side made a grim discovery. In the overgrown backyard of a rundown property on Camden Street, the worker stumbled upon what looked like a human skull. Detroit police were called to the scene, where they confirmed the presence of skeletal human remains. Scattered bones and a skull lay hidden behind the empty home, telling a silent story of a life cut short. Investigators quickly determined the remains belonged to a young woman. However, there was no identification, no purse or ID left behind, just bones. The question that loomed over the scene was obvious. Who was she? And what happened to her? The Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office took custody of the remains and began trying to piece together the story. Forensic experts estimated the victim was a black female, likely between 18 and 22 years old at the time of death. She was tall, and investigators believed that she may have stood 6'1", an uncommon stature that investigators hoped might stand out in missing person reports. The medical examiner looked for any signs of trauma or foul play on the bones. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was difficult to determine an exact cause of death from the skeletal remains alone. Police searched the area for any other evidence and checked missing persons databases for young women who fit the description. The case was entered into the Name Us database as an unidentified female, and she became another Jane Doe from Detroit. Leads were scarce, and months turned into years with no match for the unknown woman. One early theory focused on a known missing person, Jasmine Moody, a 19-year-old college student from Texas who had vanished in Detroit in 2014. Jasmine's disappearance had haunted her family and the authorities for years, and some wondered if this Jane Doe was her. However, DNA comparisons and dental records eventually ruled out Jasmine Moody as the unidentified victim. Other names of missing young women were considered and eliminated as well, and with each passing year, the trail grew colder. For more than 6 years, the young woman's identity and story remained unknown. Her skull and bones sat in storage at the medical examiner's office while her case file gathered dust in the Detroit Police Department's cold case unit. Investigators periodically revisited the file, hoping new information or technology might shed light on who she was. By 2023, the Detroit Police Department decided to try a new approach that has started solving cold cases around the country. At this point in the video, I'm sure you can guess what it was. But if you can't, yeah, it was forensic genetic genealogy again. In late 2023 and early 2024, this painstaking research finally yielded a promising lead. A possible relative of the Jane Doe had been identified. Detectives reached out and located this family member, explaining the situation. The relative agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison, which would lead to a major breakthrough. In March 2025, nearly 7 years after her remains were first found, the Detroit Police Department announced a major development. Yet another Jane Doe had her identity restored at last thanks to forensic genealogy. The skeletal remains were conclusively identified as Tiffany Tillman, a 26-year-old woman who had likely died around late 2017 or 2018. Tiffany Tillman was born on February 8, 1992, and would have been in her mid-20s at the time of her disappearance and death. While identifying Tiffany Tillman marked a huge step forward, the case was far from fully solved. With her identity known, the investigation is now shifting focus to how Tiffany died and who, if anyone, was responsible. As of now, the authorities have not yet announced a cause of death in Tiffany's case, or whether they had any suspects in mind. The circumstances of her body's discovery, hidden behind a vacant house, strongly suggests that something sinister could have happened. For nearly 3 decades, the identity of an elderly woman found buried in the Southern California desert remained unknown. In March 1994, a group of hunters in the remote Colorado desert near Chiriaco Summit in the Coachella Valley discovered a set of human remains. This woman's remains had been uncovered by a particularly heavy rainstorm which recently hit the area. Authorities determined the victim was a white female between 70 and 85 years old. She had thin white hair about 5 inches long and was found clad only in a disposable adult diaper and a pink robe with no tags or labels. No form of identification was with the body, and investigators quickly concluded that she had been slain. The mystery of who this woman was and how she ended up in a shallow grave would haunt detectives for decades. The discovery on March 9, 1994, set off an immediate investigation by the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. The remains were located several miles off any paved road, indicating that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the body in the open desert. An autopsy and examination of the body provided some critical clues about the victim's condition. She was petite, approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall and about 100 pounds, and appeared frail and sickly. Notably, medical examiners found severe bed sores all over the backside of her body. These painful pressure sores indicated that the woman had likely been bedridden and completely immobilized for a long period before her death. This suggested she had been under someone else's care and likely in extremely poor health. Investigators also observed that the elderly woman had no teeth and was not wearing any dentures at the time she was found. She had no jewelry or personal effects on her, and the pink bathrobe she wore bore no identification marks. All of these factors made identifying her extremely difficult, as there were no obvious initial clues to her name or background. With no ID on the body, investigators turned to missing persons reports and public outreach. They created a composite sketch of the victim's face in hopes that someone would recognize her. This sketch, a penciled rendering of an elderly woman with her hair pulled back, was circulated in local media and to various agencies. Authorities were hopeful that an acquaintance, neighbor, or relative might see the likeness and come forward with a name. Additionally, given the victim's advanced age and medical condition, police checked with nursing homes and hospitals to see if any patients had gone missing. They also looked for any reports of missing elderly women in Southern California around that time, but despite these efforts, no matches were found. No family members contacted the sheriff's department, and no caretakers reported a patient missing. The anonymous victim came to be known only as the Chiriaco Summit Jane Doe, and as months turned into years, the case went cold. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, the unidentified victim's case sat on the shelf with few new leads. In 2009, the case details were entered into the newly formed Name Us database. This ensured that her physical description and circumstances were accessible to law enforcement nationwide. But even with wider circulation, her identity remained a mystery. Periodically, investigators revisited the case, but without a name or any new evidence, progress was limited. The passage of time led to growing speculation about who this woman was and how she met her fate. One puzzling aspect was that no missing person report ever matched the victim. In fact, it was later confirmed that the Jane Doe, as she then was, had never been officially reported missing by anyone. For law enforcement, this was a troubling clue. It suggested that those who knew the victim in life either were unaware of her disappearance or had reasons not to report it. Over the years, the leading theory that took hold was that the victim may have been slain by someone close to her. They may have found themselves unable or unwilling to continue caring for a sick elderly relative. The presence of bed sores supported the idea that she had been bedridden and completely dependent on others. However, without an identity, it was impossible to confirm any such theory. It wasn't clear whether she was a local resident of the Coachella Valley or brought in from elsewhere, potentially even out of state. All authorities knew for certain was that an elderly woman had been slain somewhere else and then dumped in the desert, and nobody had stepped forward to even report her missing. As the case languished, forensic technology was advancing. By the 2010s, DNA analysis had become a game changer in cracking unsolved cases such as this. In the 90s, DNA testing was in its infancy and typically required substantial good samples. But by the 2010s, even old degraded remains could sometimes yield a DNA profile. Another problem was that DNA could only be tested against people who were in databases themselves or had very close relatives in them. In this case, biological samples had been preserved, but earlier attempts to identify her through DNA were unsuccessful because there was no matching profile in law enforcement databases. She had likely never been arrested or entered into any criminal database, and her immediate family's DNA wasn't in any database either. Traditional forensic DNA comparison hit a dead end, but the new technique of forensic genetic genealogy offered a different approach. In 2021, the Riverside County Cold Case Unit decided to apply advanced DNA techniques to the decades-old mystery. They partnered with Othram, a Texas-based laboratory specializing in cold case identifications. Othram's team was able to extract DNA and use their innovative forensic-grade genome sequencing technique to build a comprehensive genetic profile of the victim. This process involves sequencing hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, far more than standard law enforcement DNA tests, enabling even distant familial matches to be detected. Once Othram had developed the profile, the data was returned to Riverside County investigators for genealogical analysis. Armed with this new DNA profile, investigators began to construct the victim's family tree. Little by little, distant cousins and relatives were identified through shared DNA markers. Researchers followed these clues like branches, working backward to find a common ancestor, and then forward through family lines. It was a painstaking process, but eventually it led to a promising name: Claire Antonia Deverak. Once her identity was known, detectives and journalists began digging into Claire Deverak's life story. Records showed that she was born Claire Antonia Callis in 1907 in Chicago, Illinois. Not much is known about her early life, though it is known that her parents had been German immigrants. In 1939, she married a man named Joseph Deverak, and the couple started a family, and they had two children, named Donald and Joanne. Sometime in the late 40s, the Deveraks moved to Florida, settling in Pinellas County, where he worked as a farmer while she was a homemaker. After spending a number of years in Florida, the family eventually moved west to Arizona. By the 1980s, they were living in Scottsdale, and in 1986, Joseph Deverak passed away while they were still residing there. Now widowed and in her late 70s, Claire apparently decided to relocate again. Sometime after her husband's death, she moved to California's Coachella Valley, possibly to be closer to one of her adult children or other family. She acquired a home in the area, and this is the residence from which she ultimately disappeared, sometime in the early 90s. A striking fact emerged during the investigation of Claire's background. Despite her sudden disappearance and violent end, no missing persons report was ever filed. Neither her children nor any other family or neighbors reported her as missing to the authorities. This explains why law enforcement had no leads in 1994. Claire wasn't listed as a missing person in any database. The lack of a report is now a critical element of the mystery. It hints that someone close to Claire might have known more about her fate and chosen to stay silent. Identifying Claire was a major breakthrough, but it was only the first step in resolving this cold case. With her name and history known, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department has turned their focus toward finding out who was responsible for her death. The case is now being investigated as an active slaying, albeit one that's 30 years old. Publicly, authorities have remained tight-lipped about any suspects or persons of interest. However, the very nature of the crime suggests a limited pool of potential perpetrators, likely those in Claire's immediate circle. Because she was elderly and infirm, she wouldn't have been physically capable of traveling far on her own. Instead, the evidence points to someone who had access to this vulnerable woman. At this stage, her cause of death hasn't been publicly released, but it was deemed a slaying by the coroner back in 1994. So what happens next to bring justice for Claire Deverak? Aside from the obvious first step of taking a very close look into her family, there are some other less obvious steps that could be taken. An effective investigation may begin with a close review of Claire's financial footprint, treating her bank and Social Security activity as a potential roadmap to her final months. Unusual ATM use or transfers to third parties may signal financial exploitation, pointing toward a caregiver or family member who had access to her accounts. Further, if someone kept cashing her checks after her body was found, that would raise suspicions on that person significantly. Next, authorities could systematically examine records from care homes and home health agencies in the Coachella Valley area. Intake forms, admission dates, and nursing notes could reveal when Claire last received professional care and who was responsible for her daily needs. Cross-referencing staffing rosters with incident reports may uncover witnesses to neglect. Unfortunately, these records may now largely be destroyed, not as an attempt to eliminate evidence, but due to regulatory record-keeping requirements. Finally, the authorities may want to consider a further investigation of the shallow grave. Given advancements in ground-penetrating radar, it's always possible that further evidence which could fully solve this case remains out there in the desert. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you appreciate my content. Also remember to check out my other channels for unsolved mysteries and historical content. On January 12, 1993, a man out for a walk in the woods in Orlando, Florida, made a grim discovery near the intersection of Heather Road and Dennis Avenue. The skeletal remains of an adult male were found lying in the underbrush. The Orange County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene after the passerby hurried to a nearby store to call authorities. Investigators noted the victim was a white male, approximately 5'10", and estimated to be between 45 and 55 years old. The deceased man was wearing a blue tank top, blue jeans, and socks, but carried no identification of any kind. From the start, deputies treated the area as a crime scene, and a forensic examination confirmed that the man had been slain with a single shot to the head. In the weeks and months following the discovery, Orange County detectives scoured missing person reports and forensic records, hoping to match the John Doe to someone reported missing. The timing seemed like it should have been a crucial clue. The remains were found in early 1993, and indeed a local man had been reported missing just a couple of weeks before the discovery. In fact, Greg Carpenter had last been seen alive on December 26, 1992, and his family reported him missing to the Orlando police that very same day. This was only 17 days before the unidentified body was found. Yet, despite this proximity of the reports and the fact they were in the same jurisdiction, authorities at the time didn't manage to connect the cases. It's unclear why exactly this was, since Greg Carpenter fit the profile of the John Doe exactly. Over the years, law enforcement compared the John Doe's profile against nationwide missing persons, but no match was found. With limited technology in the early 1990s, investigators had exhausted traditional methods. Fingerprints were impossible due to decomposition, and DNA profiling was in its infancy. They relied on dental records and missing persons flyers, but nothing panned out, and there was official speculation that he may have been a tourist who never made it home. The case file lingered in the cold case unit, periodically revisited as technology improved. However, without a name, solving the case itself was next to impossible. Detectives had little to go on regarding motive or suspects. The manner of death, an execution-style shot, suggested the possibility of an illicit business dispute gone horribly wrong. But again, authorities could only speculate. In the late 2010s, Orange County cold case detectives began reviewing old John and Jane Doe files to see if DNA technology could shed new light. In 2022, they partnered with Othram to attempt to crack the case with genetic genealogy. With this profile in hand, Othram's in-house team searched for relatives by comparing the victim's DNA to profiles uploaded in public genealogy databases. Before long, they found genetic matches to distant relatives of the John Doe. These leads were handed back to Orange County investigators, and the detectives on the case then conducted a follow-up investigation, contacting potential family members. In 2024, Orange County detectives announced that the 30-year mystery had been solved. The remains were positively identified as Greg Carpenter, born in 1947. Greg Carpenter was not a mysterious stranger after all. He was a 44-year-old Orlando man who had vanished during the 1992 Christmas season. Born into a military family in 1947, Carpenter had spent much of his life in Central Florida, graduating from a local high school. When he disappeared on December 26, 1992, his family immediately knew something was wrong and filed a missing persons report. Sadly, they would spend the next 31 years without answers, and in the meantime, Carpenter's parents passed away, not knowing his fate. With Greg Carpenter's identity confirmed, the Orange County Sheriff's Office officially reclassified the file from an unidentified person case to an active investigation. In July 2024, they publicly announced Carpenter's name and appealed for new information about the circumstances of his death. Detectives are now piecing together Carpenter's last known activities in late 1992. It's known that he spent Christmas Day 1992 with family or friends, but details have not been released beyond those basic facts, and what ended up happening afterward remains a mystery. Investigators are pursuing leads to determine who Carpenter was with when he disappeared and any possible motives for his slaying. Because the case is over 30 years old, potential witnesses' memories have faded, and some individuals who knew Greg might be hard to find. Nevertheless, authorities are hopeful that someone, somewhere has information that could further crack the case. They have urged anyone who knew Greg Carpenter or has knowledge whatsoever about his life to come forward. They've stressed that even seemingly small details about his relationships, business dealings, or habits could provide the clue needed to identify a suspect. At present, we don't know what steps investigators have taken, but we can speculate about other forensic techniques that could be used. Investigators could use isotopic and elemental bone analysis to pinpoint Greg's geographic movements before his passing. This may reveal where he lived or traveled in the months leading up to December 1992. This could be coupled with forensic palynology, the science of analyzing microscopic pollen or soil grains still trapped in his clothing. This, of course, assumes that the clothing was preserved and not contaminated afterwards. Combining these two avenues of forensic science could allow the authorities to unlock personal connections outside the Orlando area. For example, it could indicate that he was in a certain region of Texas, and the authorities could spread word of his identity there through the local news and social media. Another potential avenue is to reinvestigate the crime scene for further clues that may have been missed. For instance, the authorities could retain forensic archaeologists and conduct ground-penetrating radar scans to determine if there are any abnormalities in the area where Greg was found. While this is a long shot, especially given the passage of time, it could yield the one clue that cracks the remainder of the case wide open. Forensic accountants could also be retained to examine his financial interactions for any irregularities, or at least to find further social or business connections. However, this again may be difficult given the passage of time and the destruction and loss of records over the decades. Shirley Brandt was a 49-year-old mother of four and a successful real estate broker in North Miami Beach, Florida. She was known as an extremely driven businesswoman who had established one of the most successful real estate agencies in the area. On June 13, 1986, Shirley's life was cut tragically short. Shirley was working in her office, the Brandt Realty Corporation, and speaking on the phone when two strangers walked in. The men were conspicuously well-dressed, wearing dress pants and collared shirts, perhaps to pass as clients and avoid arousing suspicion. An employee in the office later told police she heard Shirley suddenly scream, then saw one of the men attempting to wrestle the phone away from her. A shot rang out, and Shirley Brandt was struck at point-blank range. The two assailants grabbed Shirley's purse, escaping with cash and her credit cards, before fleeing the scene. Critically wounded, Shirley was rushed to hospital, but she succumbed to her injuries shortly after arrival. North Miami Beach police initially launched an intensive investigation in the wake of the slaying. Investigators canvassed the area and even distributed thousands of flyers with the perpetrator's description in hopes of generating leads. The crime appeared to be a robbery turned slaying, and the fact that Shirley's credit cards were stolen but never used eliminated one potential trail for detectives to follow. Crucially, police did recover fingerprints from the scene, and keep this in mind, because this isn't a case that will be solved by cutting-edge forensic science. However, at the time in 1986, those latent prints were not entered into any automated database. According to North Miami Beach Police, the prints didn't meet certain criteria for submission to the automated fingerprint identification system back then. In the 1980s, forensic technology and databases were far more limited than today, so the prints remained on file but unmatched. With no immediate hits on suspects and scant physical evidence beyond the unusable fingerprints, the investigation struggled, and months passed with no updates. Despite the Brandt family's persistent push for answers, the case gradually went cold as the leads dried up, and one by one the original detectives retired. Shirley's family never forgot the tragedy, and they never stopped seeking justice. Her husband, local dentist Dr. Lawrence Brandt, was especially resolute. He spent a fortune hiring private investigators to ensure no stone was unturned, but these efforts appear to have come to nothing, aside from keeping the case on police radar. It turns out this consistent attention on Shirley's case would pay dividends, but not until many years down the line. And then, just like that, nearly 40 years had passed. In 2024, the long-dormant case was revived by having a fresh look at the evidence with an old set of eyes. The North Miami Beach Police Department's Cold Case Unit launched a renewed investigation into Shirley Brandt's slaying. Notably, they brought two retired detectives who had worked on the original case, Sergeant Pamela Denham and Sergeant Yvette Darden. These seasoned investigators volunteered to pore over the old evidence, determined to crack one of the city's longest-running unsolved cases. During the cold case review, Denham, Darden, and the team re-examined the latent fingerprints collected at the crime scene. This time, using modern forensic technology, they submitted the prints to the National Fingerprint Database. In March 2025, a stunning result came back. The prints from Shirley's office matched an individual's records. After decades of uncertainty, police had a name. The fingerprint identified Jeffrey Taylor, a 64-year-old man living in Liberty City, Miami. Taylor was 26 years old at the time of Shirley Brandt's slaying. At the press conference announcing the arrest, the North Miami Beach police chief described Taylor as a, quote, career criminal with a long history of offenses. Back in 1986, Taylor's name had never come up in the Brandt investigation. He wasn't an acquaintance of Shirley's, and the robbery appeared to be a random attack. Police alleged that Jeffrey Taylor was the man who pulled the trigger on that fateful day in 1986. According to investigators, Taylor and his accomplice had burst into Shirley's office intending to rob her. When Shirley resisted by refusing to hang up the phone and tried to get help, a struggle ensued and Taylor fired the shot. After the shooting, the two men grabbed what they could, cash and credit cards, and bolted, leaving Shirley mortally wounded on the office floor. For nearly 4 decades, those men remained unidentified, but now, at least one of them had a face and a name. The second suspect, however, has never been identified, and police have affirmed that the investigation remains open as they continue to hunt for the other man involved. Some have speculated that Taylor will hold back this information as leverage, given the severity of the crime he's accused of, and given that the existence of an accomplice is confirmed. On April 24, 2025, a team of officers moved to finally bring Jeffrey Taylor into custody. He was arrested and charged with second-degree slaying in Shirley Brandt's passing. Because this was an open warrant on a case of this nature, the court ordered that Taylor be held without bond. Nearly 40 years after Shirley's life was taken, the accused perpetrator will now face justice in a courtroom. For the time being, however, Taylor remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also be sure to check out my other channels for more content related to unsolved mysteries in history. On September 23, 1991, drivers along a quiet stretch of Neptune Road in St. Cloud, Florida, stumbled upon a horrifying scene. They discovered the body of 27-year-old Julia Wilbanks lying in a ditch by the roadside. Julia, a single mother, had been stabbed approximately 17 times, including fatal wounds to her heart. The attack was vicious and personal, and by the time help arrived, she had already been dead for over 24 hours. A group of passing motorists finally noticed her body and flagged down a police officer, bringing an end to the lonely final chapter of her life. The violent death of this young mother shocked the community and set in motion a massive police investigation. Detectives scoured the area for evidence and interviewed anyone who might have information, but leads were scarce. One crucial piece of evidence did emerge: a drop of blood on Wilbanks's denim shorts that didn't belong to her. Investigators believed this blood came from the perpetrator responsible for this cruel act and developed a rudimentary DNA profile from the sample. Little did the perp know that this single drop would be a calling card throughout time, unlocked with future technology. Throughout the 1990s, they compared this DNA profile against multiple potential suspects, hoping for a match, but each comparison came up empty. Despite the diligent work of investigators, this hard work never led to any arrests in those early years. By the late 1990s, the Julia Wilbanks investigation had gone cold, and there were no new leads and no publicly known suspects. Thankfully, investigators preserved the evidence, including the offender's DNA, with the hope that someday technology or new information might revive the investigation. In 2012, more than 2 decades after the attack, St. Cloud detectives took a fresh look at the cold case using new forensic tools. They reopened the investigation and submitted the unknown DNA profile to a company specializing in genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, at the time, this technology was in its infancy, and nothing could be done with the sample. However, by the early 2020s, things had drastically changed, and this technology was now rapidly solving cases around the world. In 2025, the authorities again used the DNA profile in hopes of solving the case. They searched through national public DNA databases for any familial links to the mystery profile. The idea is that even if the perpetrator had never given a DNA sample to police, one of their relatives might have uploaded DNA data to a public genealogy site. This would then provide the beginning of a network of clues that could be used to narrow down the suspect. Nearly 33 years after Julia's slaying, the persistence of the investigators finally paid off big time. The cold case team had finally zeroed in on a name: Gene Stuller. Gene Stuller, a 72-year-old man living in Apopka, Florida, suddenly found himself under the microscope of investigators in 2025. It turned out that back in 1991, Stuller had lived near Julia's last known residence in Kissimmee, uncomfortably close to the victim's home at the time of the slaying. This discovery added a context to the DNA match, suggesting that the suspect might not have been a random stranger at all, but perhaps someone who had even known Julia. Once he was identified as a person of interest, detectives moved quickly to confirm the DNA evidence. In March 2025, undercover officers surveilled Stuller and managed to obtain a piece of physical evidence: a discarded drinking straw that he had used and thrown away. From this item, forensic analysts extracted Stuller's DNA profile. The results were decisive. The DNA from the straw was an exact match from the DNA from the 1991 crime scene. After decades of mystery, the perpetrator's identity was backed by solid scientific proof. With DNA evidence in hand, authorities moved to finally close the case. On April 21st, 2025, St. Cloud police officers arrived at Gene Stuller's home in Apopka and placed the 72-year-old under arrest. The long-running cold case had at last produced a suspect in custody. For the law enforcement officers involved, it was a moment of triumph and relief. a testament to their determination and the power of modern forensic science. In Stuller's quiet Apopka neighborhood, the arrest came as an unwelcome surprise. Neighbors who knew the elderly man were stunned to learn that he was accused of a brutal decades-old slaying. Stuller had lived in that community for roughly 20 years, and those who interacted with him saw him as a good-natured retiree. In fact, one of his neighbors was quoted as saying after his arrest that he was, quote-unquote, a nice fella. But wait, there's more. This same neighbor also said he would miss having him around, which is an extremely questionable comment given the context. The contrast between Stuller's public persona and the crime he's accused of is stark. Police disclosed that Stuller's past criminal record was minimal and he had no apparent history of violence. All his previous offenses were substance-related, but there was absolutely nothing to indicate the violence he was capable of. In hindsight, his relatively low-profile life may have helped him avoid suspicion for so many years, including at the time of the initial investigation. Gene Stuller has now officially been charged in connection with Julia's death. Following his arrest, he was booked into jail and continues to await further legal proceedings. Based on the present reporting, it remains unclear how he will plead in this case. The case will now move into the courts, where prosecutors will present the evidence gathered, including the DNA match. Currently, it's unclear if the accused perpetrator and Julia were acquainted with one another, and if they were, what the nature of their relationship was. Gene Stuller remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. On October 30th, 1984, Arkansas highway workers made a grim discovery along Interstate 40. While mowing grass near Carlisle, just outside Little Rock, they came across the body of an adult man left on the roadside. An autopsy later revealed that the man had been strangled, and his case was unsurprisingly immediately classified as a slaying. Investigators found no identification on the victim, and no immediate clues to his name, nor any clues as to the perpetrator. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the victim remained unidentified. With no name and few leads to follow, the investigation stalled. The unknown man was recorded as a John Doe in police records, and later listed in a national database as the Lonoke County John Doe. For nearly 40 years, the man's file gathered dust, and his true identity and the story behind his death remained a painful mystery. After decades of dead ends, a fresh break came in 2024. The Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit decided to reopen the investigation into the 1984 roadside slaying. Advances in forensic technology offered new hope for a case once thought unsolvable. In September 2024, cold case investigators submitted the victim's remains to Othram Labs, a specialized DNA testing and forensic genealogy company in Texas. For the first time in decades, there was a glimmer of hope that the victim's identity could be found. In early 2025, the DNA efforts paid off with a crucial breakthrough. On January 27, 2025, Othram Labs reported a tentative identification to the ASP. They believed the long unidentified victim was Earl James McDaniel. Along with this tentative ID came a lead. The lab had identified a possible relative of the victim in Washington state. ASP investigators, working in coordination with the Washington State Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, tracked down that relative, who turned out to be McDaniel's daughter. The woman provided her own DNA sample, which was sent to the lab for comparison. In late February 2025, the results came back, confirming the match. The John Doe was indeed Earl James McDaniel. After 4 decades of anonymity, the victim finally had his name restored. With the identification confirmed, investigators could finally piece together Earl James McDaniel's backstory. McDaniel was 53 years old at the time of his death and originally hailed from Kansas City, Missouri. His life had been turbulent, and records showed he spent time incarcerated in Washington state during the 1960s. After this, he had numerous run-ins with the law across the country in the years that followed. In the early 1980s, he was paroled from prison in Oklahoma, after which he continued moving from state to state, perhaps living as a drifter. In fact, McDaniel's last known interaction in life was with law enforcement on September 11th, 1984. Police in Oskaloosa, Iowa, arrested him for drunk driving, though no further details of the case have been released at this time. After that date, McDaniel effectively vanished from official records. Just weeks later, the day before Halloween in 1984, he was found deceased in Arkansas. How he ended up strangled and dumped by an Arkansas highway so soon after his Iowa arrest is a question that still haunts investigators. Thanks to DNA and dogged investigative work, the 40-year-old mystery of the victim's identity has been solved, but a new question has taken its place. Who ended the life of Earl and why? The most common speculation is that his criminal past caught up to him and he ran afoul of a much more dangerous individual. That said, this is purely speculation at this time. The authorities have not indicated what further evidence they have from the scene, or if there are any DNA profiles which may be associated with the perpetrator. Marianne Perez was a 33-year-old mother of three from Chalmette, Louisiana, who vanished on a spring night in 1976. On March 25, 1976, she left home to go out with a friend to a bar on the outskirts of New Orleans, entrusting her teenage daughter Donna to babysit her younger children. True to her word, Marianne phoned home around 10:30 p.m. to let Donna know she was safe and would be back soon. But later that night, Donna received a second call from an unfamiliar woman calling herself Dorothy, who claimed that Marianne's car had broken down. This excuse immediately alarmed the family, particularly Marianne's brother, since her car was practically new and had no reason to break down. Marianne never returned home that night, and she would never be seen alive again. The following day, police discovered Marianne's car abandoned in the bar's parking lot, and 3 days later, her purse was found submerged in Lake Pontchartrain with a brick inside it. These clues strongly suggested foul play, but investigators had few leads to pursue. With only an empty car and a waterlogged purse, the case quickly shifted from a missing person search to a suspected abduction and slaying. Her family was desperate for answers, yet days turned into months with no trace of Marianne. 8 months later, in November 1976, hunters stumbled upon human remains in a cornfield near Grand Bay, Alabama, just beyond the Mississippi state line. The skeletal remains were clad in clothing and clearly belonged to a woman. Investigators noted distinctive clues. The skull showed signs of prior injury consistent with a past car accident, and a partial dental plate was present with the remains. These details would later sound eerily familiar to Marianne's family, who knew she had been in a car crash and wore a partial dental plate. At the time, however, Alabama authorities had no idea who their Jane Doe was. They sent her remains to a forensic lab in Oklahoma, hoping that would lead to a break in the case. Little did they know that it actually would, but they'd have to wait nearly half a century for that to happen. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, so hold tight. In the 70s, there were no national DNA databases or interstate computer networks, and information sharing between jurisdictions was limited. No one in Louisiana connected the Alabama Jane Doe with Marianne's disappearance, so the two cases remained separate mysteries. With no identification and no new leads, the trail in Marianne's case went cold. In 1980, investigators got what would turn out to be a major break in Mary Ann's case from an unexpected source. A drifter couple, David and Donna Courtney, were arrested for a multi-state crime spree and pleaded guilty to a number of slayings. As part of their confession, the Courtneys admitted they had abducted a woman in New Orleans in 1976, a story that sounded just like Mary Ann's fate. David explained that he spotted a lone woman who was too intoxicated to drive at a bar outside New Orleans and offered to give her a ride home, which she accepted. Instead of taking her straight home, he brought the woman to the trailer where he and his wife were living, and there the victim fell asleep. The woman was then jolted awake by Donna's unwanted advances. When the startled woman grew upset and demanded to be taken home, the couple agreed to drive her, but by then they had decided she couldn't be allowed to live. According to David's account, as Donna drove the car, he strangled the victim from the back seat with a coat hanger. They dumped the body on a rural roadside near a state border, but when police later searched those areas, no remains were found. The Courtneys led authorities to the graves of several of their other victims, but in the New Orleans case, they couldn't pinpoint where they left the body. Without a corpse or any physical evidence, Louisiana prosecutors couldn't charge the couple in Mary Ann's case. Officially, Mary Ann remained a missing person, even though investigators now strongly suspected what had happened to her. In 1991, 15 years after her disappearance, the family received a strange phone call that briefly rekindled their hopes. A woman on the line claimed she was calling on Mary Ann's behalf, insisting that Mary Ann was still alive but not allowed to contact her family. Some relatives wondered if this could be true, speculating that Mary Ann had survived with amnesia or been held captive without any memory of her identity. Others suspected it was a cruel hoax by someone playing on the family's desperation. Either way, no evidence ever surfaced to support the caller's story, and Mary Ann's case remained in limbo with no closure. Over 40 years later, her children were grown adults, still waiting for answers, and the mystery of Mary Ann's disappearance was finally solved through a mix of persistence and luck. In the late 2010s, Mobile County Sheriff's Detective J.T. Thornton began re-examining cold cases in Alabama, including the unidentified woman found in 1976. A Mississippi investigator happened to mention Mary Ann's long unsolved missing person case to Thornton, prompting him to reach out to her family. When relatives described Mary Ann's prior car accident and her partial dental plate, Thornton immediately recognized those details as a perfect match to the Jane Doe. Thornton soon discovered that the Jane Doe's remains had never been buried, and the bones were still stored in Oklahoma, where they had been sent decades earlier. However, the case file and the remains had never been connected to Mary Ann until now. Then, by pure chance, an investigator from the Alabama Attorney General's office who specialized in cold cases contacted Thornton. He asked about the same unidentified remains, not realizing Thornton was already working that case. In that moment, they realized that Mary Ann Perez and the Alabama Jane Doe were almost certainly one and the same. The remains were finally transferred to a Texas lab for DNA testing, and the results confirmed the remains were indeed from her. For Mary Ann's family, this revelation brought both relief and heartbreak. They had definitive answers at last, even though it confirmed the tragedy they had long feared. One of the perps, David Courtney, remains behind bars serving a life sentence. Donna Courtney died years before the case was closed and will sadly never face further justice for this horrific crime. On a warm June day in 1980, a gruesome discovery jolted Ada County, Idaho. A highway work crew found the body of a young woman hidden in tall grass beside Highway 55 near an irrigation ditch. Investigators soon identified the victim as 25-year-old Mary Tracy, a Boise resident who had been reported missing 2 days earlier. From the start, detectives faced a perplexing crime scene. The autopsy revealed Mary suffered at least 11 stab wounds, along with a fatal thrust to her heart and a blow to the back of her head. Yet oddly, there was little blood at the spot where her body was found, suggesting she might have been slain elsewhere and dumped by the roadside. An old scrap of newspaper was found stuck to Mary's face, and a bloody fingerprint stained the skin on her back. These curious details hinted that the perpetrator tried to clean up or move her body. Before long, rumors swirled that Mary's slaying may have occurred behind closed doors at a local motel. The Sunliner Motel, not far from where Mary was last seen, drew investigators' attention after a tip that a violent struggle had happened there. The motel's management initially denied anything unusual, but one maid disclosed that she had cleaned an unusually large amount of blood from a guest room around that time. Despite this lead, finding the perp proved extraordinarily difficult. Detectives questioned everyone in her life. Mary's estranged husband was initially a person of interest, but he had been hospitalized on the night of the slaying and was quickly ruled out. Neighbors reported seeing Mary arguing with an unknown man on a motorcycle the day she disappeared, a clue that raised more questions than answers. Police canvassed the seedy strip of clubs on Chinden Boulevard in Garden City, where Mary spent her final hours, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen her, or the mystery biker. Notably, Garden City is entirely surrounded by the city of Boise, but retains its own separate municipal government structure. Cops chased down rumors and interviewed motel staff and locals, but no solid suspect emerged. With only fragments of evidence and no one to charge, the case went cold. Months turned into years, then decades, and Mary Tracy's tragic end slipped into the realm of memory. For 43 years, Mary's loved ones waited for answers. Her daughter grew up never knowing who had slain her mother, and the ache of that uncertainty lingered. In 2023, Mary's family reached out to ask the Ada County Sheriff's Office to reopen the investigation. A cold case investigator, Detective Tim Cooper, was assigned in August 2023 to pore over the old files with fresh eyes. What he found buried in boxes of reports would finally break the case open. Cooper discovered a forgotten clue from the original investigation. A jailhouse snitch had once told police about a man bragging of a case that sounded eerily like Mary's. According to a handwritten note in the case file, an inmate named Jose claimed that back in 1980, his friend Chuck Strain confessed to stabbing a girl and dumping her body off a road. At the time, without physical evidence, that tip led nowhere. But now, decades later, it became a centerpiece of the renewed probe. Cooper even unearthed the old audio recording of the informant's interview, which confirmed key details. Jose had actually spoken with Strain at 11 p.m. on June 24, 1980, the very night Mary vanished, and Strain had explicitly mentioned dumping the body off Highway 55. Those facts uncannily matched the crime, elevating Strain to the top of Cooper's suspect list. Once Strain was in focus, his dark history began to spread across the case. Back in 1980, Strain was a drifter with a record of robbery across several states, but nothing indicated he was capable of such extreme violence. Not long after Mary's death, Strain's known history of violence escalated, indicating that Mary may have been his first slaying. In 1981, he kidnapped his own 10-year-old daughter and fled Idaho, evading authorities for years. Worse, that same year he took the life of his 16-year-old stepdaughter in a crime that wouldn't be solved until 1986. Strain was eventually convicted of that disturbing act and sent to prison in Utah, where he eventually died in 2007. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with modern DNA technology. Back in 1980, forensic science had preserved crucial evidence from Mary's body containing the attacker's genetic material. In the wake of Cooper's discoveries, Ada County authorities submitted this old DNA evidence for advanced testing, specifically comparing it to Chuck Strain's profile. In a fortunate break, a sample of Strain's blood had been preserved by the medical examiner after his death, providing a direct source for comparison. By June 2024, the results came back from the state lab with a definitive answer. The DNA from Mary Tracy's assault kit matched Strain's DNA. After nearly half a century, science had caught up with this now deceased perpetrator. Though he would never face justice for Mary Tracy's death specifically, this resolution brought a long-awaited sense of justice for her family. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also be sure to check out my other channels for more content related to unsolved mysteries in history. On the morning of September 20th, 1987, joggers in Dana Point, California made a grim discovery. The body of a young woman lay at the base of a steep seaside cliff. Sheriff's deputies arrived to investigate the unidentified victim, a Caucasian woman in her 20s with no ID on her person. It was initially unclear whether she had fallen by accident, been pushed, or done it all on her own. With no name to call her, authorities referred to the mystery woman simply as the Dana Point Jane Doe, a case that haunted investigators for decades. At the top of the cliff, investigators found several personal items left behind by the young woman. A small purse sat near a half-finished soda can, alongside a pack of cigarettes and a road map of Southern California. Importantly, a phone number written on the map led investigators to a local taxi company. The cab driver remembered picking up a quiet young woman that morning and dropping her off near the Dana Point Cliffs, since she had only $18 for the fare. Further investigation pieced together the woman's last movements. Staff at a nearby motel recalled that the young woman had come in, asking if there were any tall hotels in the area. Notably, this stuck out to them since it was a somewhat unusual request. Why was this woman so concerned about the height of the building she was staying in? Shortly afterward, she was seen at a gas station, where she used the restroom and then called for a cab. She told the taxi driver that her car had broken down and asked to go toward Laguna Beach, or as far as her money would take her. The driver let her out on a coastal road near the cliffs, which was as far as he could take her for $18. That was the last time anyone saw her alive, as she walked off into the darkness toward the cliff's edge. At dawn, her body was found on the beach below. Investigators noted that her belongings, the soda can, cigarette pack, map, and a slip of paper with a hotel phone number were left neatly just beyond the fence at the cliff top. The evidence strongly suggested she had climbed over and jumped intentionally. The coroner eventually classified her death as likely of her own doing, while holding out hope that discovering her identity might explain what led to that tragic act. One perplexing clue was the small purse found at the scene. It contained no identification, but on the outside was a name embossed in gold: Carol Pinkham. Detectives traced that name to a woman in San Diego County who was alive and baffled to learn her stolen purse had turned up at such a scene. She explained that it had been taken from her in the mid-1970s, over a decade before the incident, and that she had no connection to the Jane Doe. How the victim came to possess that stolen purse has remained an unsolved side mystery to this day. Also, just thinking about it, it's kind of weird to think about the chain of causation from that person stealing a purse in the 1970s to that act being featured on a YouTube video a half-century later. With that lead hitting a dead end, investigators had nothing to go on but the Jane Doe's description and the circumstances of her death. For years, the Dana Point Jane Doe remained nameless despite efforts. She was a young white woman in her 20s, tall and slender with long light brown hair and brown eyes. In 1995, the popular series Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment on the case, broadcasting the Jane Doe's composite sketch and details nationwide. Despite this massive signal boost, no one came forward with a name. Many years later, a breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. Holly Glenn, a young woman from Whittier, had gone missing in 1987 around the same time as the Jane Doe was found. Decades later, high school friends searching for Holly stumbled upon the Dana Point Jane Doe case and noticed uncanny similarities. Suspecting the Jane Doe was Holly, they alerted authorities and missing person databases. By 2014, their campaign on social media prompted Orange County investigators to take a fresh look at the case. In early 2015, detectives collected DNA from Holly's relatives to compare with the Jane Doe's profile. In May 2015, nearly 28 years after the tragedy, the Orange County Sheriff's Department announced that the Dana Point Jane Doe was identified as Holly Glenn. DNA testing confirmed the match, giving a name to the victim at last. Holly had been only 21 when she died, and her family was finally able to learn her fate. The cold case mystery was solved. Holly had likely chosen to jump that night, with no foul play involved. Despite the case now being officially closed, some have speculated that the cab driver may have had some involvement in Holly's demise. After all, the circumstances under which he dropped her off are a bit unusual. That said, given that investigators found out that she was looking to find a tall hotel building, I support the official finding that this was likely an intentional act by Holly. Jeanette Ralston was a 24-year-old wife and mother living in the Bay Area of California in the late 1970s. Just before midnight on January 31st, 1977, Jeanette stepped out of San Jose's Lion's Den bar, accompanied by a man her friends didn't recognize. By the next morning, she would be found slain in her car, a crime that would go unsolved for nearly 5 decades. In the early morning of February 1st, 1977, the superintendent of an apartment complex on Graham Avenue noticed Jeanette's Volkswagen Beetle in the visitors' parking area. He felt that something looked off about the vehicle and decided to investigate further. Looking inside, the super found a horrific scene. Jeanette's lifeless body was wedged in the back seat of the car. Investigators also found burn marks inside the car, indicating a failed attempt to light the evidence on fire. San Jose police immediately opened an intensive investigation. Jeanette's friends provided a description of the unknown man from the bar, and a composite sketch of the suspect was created. Unfortunately, no one recognized the man in the sketch, and no solid suspects were identified in 1977. It appeared Jeanette had fallen victim to a chance encounter with a predator, and there were few clues about his identity. Crucially, police also recovered Jeanette's pack of smokes from the car and noted a fingerprint on it that didn't belong to her. In the 1970s, however, there was no computerized database to search for fingerprint matches, and DNA profiling didn't yet exist. Investigators compared the print against local files, but they couldn't find a match at the time. With scant leads and technology lagging behind the evidence, the case gradually went cold. By the 2010s, significant advances in forensic science offered new hope for solving the Ralston case. Santa Clara County's Cold Case Unit teamed up with San Jose detectives to re-examine the evidence with modern techniques. In 2024, investigators decided to rerun the old fingerprint from Jeanette's smokes through the latest databases. In August 2024, authorities finally identified that fingerprint as belonging to Willie Sims, a 69-year-old man living in Ohio. Back in the 1970s, there was no automated national fingerprint database, so Sims's subsequent arrest in 1978 had never been linked to Jeanette's case. The name was unfamiliar to the original case file, but further digging revealed that Sims had been in California at the time of the slaying. In 1977, he was a young Army private stationed at Fort Ord, not far from San Jose. Even more striking, Sims had a violent history. In 1978, he was convicted of assault with intent to commit a slaying in Monterey County. After serving a prison term for that offense, he left California, apparently permanently. With Sims now identified as a suspect, the cold case team moved quickly to confirm the DNA evidence. In early 2025, Santa Clara County investigators, working with Ohio police, obtained a DNA sample from Sims while he was in Ohio. The Santa Clara County Crime Lab compared Sims's sample to evidence from 1977. The results were decisive. Sims's DNA matched DNA found under Jeanette's fingernails. This forensic breakthrough provided the proof investigators needed that the same man identified by the fingerprint had indeed been at the crime scene. Based on the new evidence, prosecutors in Santa Clara County charged Willie Eugene Sims with the slaying of Jeanette Ralston. In May 2025, authorities in Ohio arrested the 69-year-old at his home in the town of Jefferson. Sims was brought before a judge in Ashtabula County, and at his arraignment, he waived his right to fight extradition to California. Arrangements were then made to transport him back to San Jose to face the charges. If convicted of Jeanette's slaying, Sims faces a penalty of 25 years to life in prison. Importantly, investigators have noted that many key witnesses from 1977 are still alive to testify. The friends who last saw Jeanette with the suspect, for example, can now potentially identify him in court. Willie Sims remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, be sure to check out my other channels for hundreds of hours of content related to mysteries and history. On February 15, 1974, 25-year-old Mary Kathleen Schloss left her apartment in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to hitchhike to an art show in Chicago. Schloss was an accomplished artist and an honors graduate of the University of Minnesota. She set off that morning after saying goodbye to her roommate, planning to catch rides on her way to Illinois, but she never arrived at her destination. Later that same day, her body was discovered in a snowbank along a rural road in Dunn County, Wisconsin, about 90 miles from Minneapolis. She had been brutally attacked, ending the life of this promising young woman far too soon. The discovery of Mary Schloss's body set off a massive investigation. Initially, a passing motorist reported seeing a man dump what he believed to be a body from a car and then speed away from the scene. The witness described the suspect as a roughly 30-year-old man driving a newer model gold-colored vehicle. Investigators rushed to the area and quickly confirmed that this witness had indeed seen a body being dumped off. Schloss's personal belongings, including her purse and coat, were missing, suggesting the perp might have taken them to conceal evidence or as a grisly souvenir. Detectives scoured the vicinity for clues and noted a peculiar piece of evidence, a knitted winter hat left near the body, which likely didn't belong to Mary. In 1974, forensic science was in its infancy, and the case depended on old-fashioned police work. Based on the eyewitness account, detectives circulated a composite sketch of the unknown suspect and an alert about the gold car, hoping to generate leads. Multiple law enforcement agencies in Wisconsin and Minnesota, including the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation, pooled their efforts in the search for the offender. Officers interviewed people who might have seen Mary or the suspect that day, but despite these efforts, no arrest was made. The composite sketch and vehicle description were publicized widely, yet no one could identify the mystery man. Mary's case gradually turned cold as the trail grew increasingly faint. Over the ensuing decades, the Schloss file was periodically dusted off and re-examined. Detectives revisited the physical evidence whenever a new forensic technique became available. They had preserved what they could: the cap, hairs found on it, and other samples from the scene. By the late 1990s, DNA profiling had emerged as a revolutionary tool. Technicians analyzed the hairs from the cap and managed to develop a partial male DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS hoping for a hit. But the result was disappointing, since the profile matched no one in the database. With no DNA match and no new witnesses, the case remained stubbornly unsolved. In 2023, a groundbreaking forensic tool finally gave the investigation new life: genetic genealogy. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office partnered with a team at Ramapo College in New Jersey, who agreed to apply this innovative method to the Schloss case. The Ramapo team painstakingly constructed an extensive family tree from the DNA data, searching for any branch that could lead to a viable suspect. According to one investigator, the family tree research in the case was very complicated and ended up taking a year to complete, but the results were worth it. Finally, the research uncovered a crucial detail. An adoption in the perpetrator's family had obscured the suspect's true identity. The man responsible for Mary's slaying was not listed in public records under the same name as his biological relatives. However, once the genealogists were able to resolve this issue, the puzzle pieces all began to fall into place. By late 2024, nearly 50 years after the crime, they identified the likely perp as John Keith Miller, an 84-year-old man living quietly in Owatonna, Minnesota. Miller was 33 years old at the time of the slaying, aligning with the description the eyewitness had given in 1974. Armed with this discovery, Dunn County authorities moved swiftly, and they obtained a DNA sample from Miller to confirm the match. On November 4, 2024, investigators received the evidence they needed. Miller's DNA was a definitive match to the crime scene profile from 1974. 3 days later, on November 7, 2024, officers knocked on John Miller's door and arrested him for the slaying of Mary Schloss. Miller's name had never appeared in the case file before, and he had no prior record that would have put his DNA in any database. When officers first questioned the elderly Miller, he denied any involvement in Schloss's slaying. But once confronted with the DNA results, Miller couldn't escape the truth. According to the criminal complaint, he admitted that on that winter day in 1974, he picked up Mary as she was hitchhiking. Miller said he asked her for intimate contact in exchange for the ride, and when 25-year-old Mary refused, he exploded in anger, ending her. Miller described for investigators how he disposed of Mary's body. He had pulled off the highway onto a quiet country road and dragged her out of his vehicle. He attempted to hide her remains in a snowbank by the roadside. At that moment, the headlights of a passing car came into view, startling Miller and causing him to flee, leaving Mary's body behind in the snow. In his haste, Miller also left behind his hat, the very piece of evidence that would, decades later, tie him to the crime. In March 2025, rather than stand trial, the 84-year-old Miller pleaded no contest to the case against him. A judge subsequently sentenced him to life in prison for the slaying, bringing closure to this case after more than 50 years. Also, just as a quick aside, pleading no contest means a defendant doesn't admit guilt, but accepts the conviction as though they had pled guilty. It has the same legal effect as a guilty plea and results in sentencing without trial. However, unlike a guilty plea, it generally can't be used as an admission of fault in civil lawsuits. It's unclear here why Miller took this route, but it can be speculated that he didn't want to further open himself up to any civil suits as a result of what he did to Mary. In February 1979, the community of Beaumont in Southern California was shattered by the disappearance and brutal slaying of 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez. Esther Gonzalez was described as a shy but friendly 17-year-old high school student. She was the fourth of 7 children in a close-knit family and was particularly close with her sister Elizabeth, who was just a year older. On the afternoon of February 9, 1979, Esther set out on foot from her parents' home in Beaumont, California, heading to her sister's house in the neighboring city of Banning. It was a short trip and one she had likely made before. But that day, Esther never arrived at her sister's home. As evening fell with no sign of her, the Gonzalez family grew anxious. The worst fears of her loved ones were confirmed the next day, when a chilling discovery was reported to authorities. On the morning of February 10, 1979, a call came into the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Banning. An anonymous male caller reported finding a body dumped off Highway 243, a winding mountain road near Banning, and noted it was lying in the snow. The caller's demeanor struck deputies as odd. He was described as argumentative and oddly evasive. For instance, they had asked him whether the body was male or female, and he reportedly freaked out and asked why they were questioning him. This suspicious level of defensiveness immediately put the so-called Good Samaritan on the radar of the authorities. Deputies raced to the remote location south of Poppet Flats Road, and there, in a snowbank by the roadside, they found the lifeless body of a young woman. It didn't take long to identify the victim as Esther Gonzalez, who had been reported missing after failing to reach her sister's house. A grim scene made it clear that Esther had been subjected to a brutal and unnatural assault prior to being slain. Immediately, detectives opened an investigation, vowing to find whoever was responsible for such a heinous act. From the start, the strange phone tip about Esther's body provided the first clue. The fact that the anonymous caller had not identified himself and had behaved argumentatively aroused significant suspicion. Investigators sensed that the caller might know more than he claimed. Tracing a tipster in 1979 wasn't as simple as it would be today, but within 5 days, Riverside County Sheriff's investigators managed to track down the caller. He was identified as 27-year-old Randy Williamson, a local man living in the area. Detectives brought Williamson in for questioning about how he came to quote-unquote discover the body. Initially, he claimed he had stumbled upon Esther's remains, but had been reluctant to get involved. Under considerable scrutiny, Williamson maintained his innocence. Investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the crime at that time. DNA profiling didn't exist yet, and other forensic techniques were limited. Eager to clear his name, Williamson agreed to take a polygraph exam, which was a common investigative tool in that era. In a development that would later haunt the case, he passed the polygraph test. In the eyes of these detectives in 1979, passing a lie detector was enough to be cleared of any wrongdoing. With the only known suspect seemingly off the hook and no arrest made, the investigation into Esther's case hit a devastating standstill. Williamson was no longer considered a suspect at all, and detectives were frustratingly left without any other leads. Despite substantial community pressure and local attention on Esther's case, the case would quickly go cold. Decades later, a fresh set of investigators would realize just how close the initial detectives were to cracking the case. In 2022, Riverside County authorities formed a dedicated cold case task force, and Esther's case was prioritized. In 2023, the team decided to leverage the latest DNA technology. They sent the preserved DNA evidence to Othram, a private forensic laboratory in Texas specializing in genetic genealogy. Othram scientists conducted advanced DNA testing, generating a comprehensive genetic profile of the unknown suspect from the crime scene. This profile was then used in a genealogical database search, building out family trees of possible relatives of the suspect. As the forensic genealogy investigation progressed, a crime analyst on the cold case team pieced together the leads. In early 2024, nearly 45 years after Esther's death, investigators had a stark realization. The man who had been their prime suspect in the beginning, Randy Williamson, had never been cleared by modern forensic standards. He had simply been crossed off as a suspect and never reinvestigated on the basis of the polygraph test alone. Also, just as a quick reminder, polygraphs are neither scientifically reliable nor admissible as evidence in court. Polygraphs measure physiological responses, not lies. Anxiety, fear, or medical conditions can trigger false positives or negatives. However, the absolute lack of anxiety or fear can also trigger false negatives. Notably, polygraphs are unreliable for psychopaths and sociopaths because they often lack physiological responses to stress or guilt. These are the responses which the interpreter relies on to detect deception. With all that said, I'm sure you can see the problem with ruling someone out as a suspect for this sort of crime on the basis of a polygraph. The hunt for Williamson was on, but they soon found that he had perished at the age of 62 in Florida. Notably, during his autopsy, a blood sample was taken, and it had been kept on file. Working in coordination with Florida authorities, Riverside County detectives obtained Williamson's autopsy blood sample. They sent it to the California Department of Justice's forensic lab for comparison against the crime scene DNA. In November 2024, the results came in. Williamson's DNA was a match to the DNA recovered from Esther Gonzalez's body. Modern science had finally caught up with the perpetrator. After 45 years, the mystery was solved, and the very man who had reported finding Esther's body in 1979 was now confirmed to be the one responsible for her demise. While Williamson unfortunately had the luxury of living out the remainder of his life as a free man, this finding brought a sense of resolution to the family. In an interview in 2024, Elizabeth, the sister who Esther was going to see on that fateful day, expressed a mixture of emotions. She expressed happiness to finally have closure in Esther's case, but expressed sadness that the man would never truly face justice for his disturbed actions. As of now, it's not clear if Randy Williamson is currently being investigated in relation to any other slayings. Personally, I can't see a situation in which he isn't going to be investigated further, given the amount of unsolved slayings in California in the 1970s. Though I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere yet, I'd imagine there's a significant possibility that Williamson may have been a serial offender. After all, people generally don't just do what was done to Esther and decide that they've had their fill, especially after getting away with it, with no consequences whatsoever. That said, based on the evidence at present, that does just remain speculation on my part.